Hello, good morning. Thanks for joining me. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. My name is Miah Jung. I am a clinical pharmacologist in the Compliance Enforcement Branch, and I work with our earlier speaker, Cheryl Grandinetti, and our next speaker, Casa Ayalu, in CEDAR's Office of Compliance, Office of Scientific Investigations. In this half hour, I will be speaking on investigator responsibilities. Here are the learning objectives. First, we'll run through good clinical practice standards and FDA regulations governing clinical trials. And next, I'll highlight clinical investigator responsibilities for clinical trial conduct and clinical trial quality. I'll briefly discuss ClinicalTrials.gov requirements and what your role or involvement might be as a clinical investigator with respect to reporting clinical trial information on ClinicalTrials.gov. Throughout, I'll aim to expand on Cheryl's earlier messaging and how risk proportionality applies to clinical investigator oversight of clinical trial conduct. Under FDA's regulations, a clinical investigator is defined as an individual who conducts a clinical investigation. So that is like under whose immediate direction the drug is dispensed to a subject. In the event an investigation is conducted by a team of individuals, the investigator is the responsible leader of the team. Under FDA regulations, a sponsor investigator is defined as an individual who both initiates and conducts an investigation, and under whose immediate direction the investigational drug is administered or dispensed. The requirements applicable to a sponsor investigator include both those applicable to a clinical investigator as well as those applicable to a sponsor. For the context of this clinical investigator training course and this session, I will be speaking to the clinical investigator requirements and responsibilities. So clinical investigators. Clinical investigators hold a critical role not only in driving medical innovation, driving advancements in medical knowledge, treatment options, but are entrusted with ensuring the safety of study participants, the integrity of data, compliance with regulatory and ethical standards in clinical research. They're central. They're central to the clinical trial environment, engaging with many different parties as shown here. Clinical investigators serve as key connection points between the study participant and the trial. Clinical investigators engage with the sponsor, engage with the IRB. FDA has an important role to play in overseeing clinical trials and verifying data submitted to FDA to ensure they're reliable and ensuring that study participants are protected. FDA does this through reviews of protocols and through clinical site inspections. So FDA's legal framework. FDA's legal framework in which clinical investigations are designed, conducted, overseen, and reported starts with the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Section 505I is the statutory authority for FDA's oversight of clinical investigations to test safety and effectiveness of investigational drugs. CFRs, or Code of Federal Regulations, include regulations describing FDA's authority over the conduct of clinical investigation, whereas guidance documents represent the agency's current thinking on a particular subject. These are not regulations, not laws. These are advisory only to assist regulated entities in complying with regulations. An alternative approach to what may be described in a guidance document may be used if the approach satisfies the requirements of the applicable statute and regulations or both. So FDA's regulations are intended to ensure the integrity of clinical data on which product approvals are based and are intended to help protect the rights, safety, and welfare of those who participate in clinical trials. FDA expects clinical investigators to know the relevant regulations and understand the clinical investigator responsibilities and to adhere to those regulatory requirements. I will highlight and cover some of these clinical investigative requirements that fall within these regulations pertaining to clinical trials and good clinical practice. Here is a sort of snapshot of some of the clinical investigator responsibilities and relevant 21 CFR regulations. I leave this here as a resource for you, but again, I'll discuss certain key clinical investigator requirements that fall within these regulations pertaining to clinical trials in the next few slides. So before we go into some of the key responsibilities for clinical investigators, I wanted to quickly touch on this slide again. It's a slide that you saw during Cheryl's session about risk proportionality expectations for clinical investigators. Clinical investigators should ensure a comprehensive and shared understanding of the study's critical to quality factors and potential risks to those critical to quality factors. And the 2 points I really want to focus on are the two last ones: focusing resources and investigator oversight on critical data points in high-risk areas, and assessing risks throughout the course of the study and adapting practices as necessary to respond to new information or unforeseen challenges that might arise in study conduct. We'll touch on this here and there through the rest of this presentation. So investigator responsibilities, they're highlighted and laid out in the statement of the investigator, the form FDA 1572. FDA regulations provide that no investigator may participate in an investigation until he or she provides the sponsor with a completed, signed statement of the investigator. I encourage you to read closely Section 9 of the 1572. It contains 8 important commitments that the investigator agrees to by signing the form. Each of these highlight key expectations of the agency. In signing the 1572, the investigator is agreeing to adhere to the approved protocol with limited exceptions. The investigator is agreeing to ensure potential participants are appropriately consented in accordance with our human subject protection regulations at Part 50. By signing the 1572, the investigator is agreeing to ensure IRB review and approval, committing to prepare and maintain accurate and adequate records, among other things. Under FDA regulations, the clinical investigator retains ultimate responsibility and is required to maintain appropriate supervision of the trial to ensure data reliability and protection of study participants. The investigator is held accountable for study conduct, including those activities that he or she may delegate to members of study staff or service providers. This really underpins the need for the clinical investigator to supervise a clinical study and to make sure that study staff and associates supporting trial conduct are aware of their obligations. As Cheryl had highlighted in her discussion on risk proportionality expectations of clinical investigators, it's critical that investigators ensure sufficient resources available to appropriately conduct the trial, focusing those resources and investigator oversight on critical data points in high-risk areas. The level of investigator oversight of the delegated activities should depend on the nature of the delegated activities and be proportionate to the importance of the data being collected and the risks to trial participant safety. So with respect to delegated trial activities, the investigator should maintain a record of delegated trial activities. So the investigator should ensure a record is maintained of the persons or parties to whom the investigator has delegated trial-related activities. Such documentation should be proportionate to the significance of the trial-related activities. So in situations where the activities are performed during clinical care, delegation documentation may not be required. The investigator should ensure that persons or parties to whom the investigator has delegated trial-related activities are appropriately qualified and are adequately informed about relevant aspects of the protocol, the investigational product, and their assigned trial activities. So with respect to trial-related training to persons assisting in the trial should correspond to what is necessary to enable them to fulfill their delegated trial activities that go beyond usual training and experience. I'd also like to note and highlight something that Cheryl had discussed in her session, risk proportionality expectations for clinical investigators includes assessing risks throughout the study and adapting practices. So that applies here as well for trial-related training. So risk proportionality expectations for clinical investigators include assessing risks throughout the study and adapting trial-related training as necessary to respond to new information or unforeseen challenges that might arise in the course of study conduct. I recommend review of this guidance document as a useful resource. This guidance document clarifies FDA's expectations concerning investigator responsibilities, including supervision, delegation of tasks to qualified individuals. IRB review and approval. So a clinical investigator must assure that an institutional review board, an IRB, that complies with the requirements set forth in Part 56 will be responsible for initial and continuing review and approval of a proposed clinical study. So IRBs have specific obligations and requirements to adhere to ensure, among other things, protection of participants' rights, safety, and welfare. Clinical investigators are responsible for submitting sufficient information, materials to the IRB so that the IRB can meet its regulatory obligations. The clinical investigator should follow institutional policies and procedures for obtaining initial and continuing review and approval of research. Informed consent requirements. Investigators must obtain legally effective informed consent of each study participant to whom the investigational drug is administered, with certain exceptions. Information should be as clear and as concise as possible. Study participants must be given an opportunity to ask questions and receive answers to those questions. Informed consent shall be documented by the use of a written consent form approved by the IRB and signed and dated by the subject or the subject's legally authorized representative at the time of consent. I'll also add whether the informed consent process takes place in person or remotely, the investigator should assure themselves of the identity of the participant or legally authorized representative in accordance to applicable regulatory requirements. Another great set of resources, I recommend you review these on informed consent. In conducting the study, the investigator must ensure that an investigation is conducted according to the signed investigator statement, so that Form FDA 1572 as we discussed earlier. The investigator must ensure the investigation is conducted in accordance to the investigational plan and applicable regulations, must ensure the protection of participants' rights, safety, and welfare, must ensure the control of drugs under investigation. The investigator is required to implement processes, measures, and approaches in a way that's proportionate to the risks to participants and to the importance of data collected. And again, focusing resources and oversight on critical data points in high-risk areas. Data management responsibilities. In generating, recording, and reporting trial data, the investigator should ensure integrity of data under their responsibility, such that data submitted to the agency can be verified for purpose of reconstructing the study. We're talking about complete, consistent, accurate, and I'll add attributable, legible, contemporaneous. As a clinical investigator, you're responsible for preparing, maintaining, or retaining records. The investigator should know and define what is considered a source record. what the methods of data capture are, the location of the study records and the study data, unnecessary transcription steps between source record and data acquisition should be avoided. Changes to source records should be traceable, should not obscure or make no longer available the original entry. Changes should be explained as necessary, whether by some notation or audit trail. Investigators should be provided with timely access to data by the sponsor and are responsible for timely review of data, including relevant data from external sources that can have an impact on participant eligibility, treatment, or safety evaluation. That being said, the protocol may have exceptions for access, for instance, to protect blinding. So I have a pop-up challenge question. Who is responsible for compliance with record keeping and record retention requirements for electronic data remotely collected for a clinical trial? A, sponsor, B, clinical investigator, C, local healthcare provider, D, data storage service provider. The answer is B, clinical investigator. So the clinical investigator is held accountable, held responsible for record keeping and record retention requirements. Clinical investigators, again, are responsible for timely review of data, including relevant data from external sources. They should ensure that they have the means and timely access to data. So, for example, if data is being collected through a web-based portal, web-based administration software for patient-reported outcome data, as a clinical investigator, you should ensure you have timely access to be able to adhere to the regulatory requirements of maintaining those records and record retention. Safety reporting requirements or responsibilities. A clinical investigator's role in safety reporting is to promptly identify, document, and report adverse events and serious adverse events that occur during a clinical trial to the study sponsor or IRB as appropriate. It's important to know the requirements and the procedures for reporting. So again, determine if an adverse event is serious. Report serious adverse events to the sponsor immediately, regardless of whether the investigator believes the SAEs are related to the drug. Record those non-serious AEs and report them to the sponsor as specified in the protocol. Generally, FDA considers a serious, unexpected adverse event that meets the criteria for an IND safety report to be an unanticipated problem involving risk to human subjects or others, and therefore must be reported to the IRB by the investigator. Again, know the requirements and procedures for reporting. As one of the last points to discuss during our time together, ClinicalTrials.gov registration and results information reporting requirements. So ClinicalTrials.gov is a web-based resource managed by the National Library of Medicine at the National Institutes of Health. It provides patients, healthcare professionals, researchers with access to information on clinical studies. It's intended to help patients and healthcare providers identify potential clinical trials, help researchers identify unmet research needs, find collaborators, stay current on developments in their field. And this is all through information sharing regarding clinical trials that have completed or are underway. So while the website's been around for over 20-some years, requirements for registering and reporting results information to ClinicalTrials.gov have really only been the regulations for a few years. The primary responsibilities related to ClinicalTrials.gov are divided between NIH, NLM, and FDA. FDA is responsible for compliance and enforcement related to ClinicalTrials.gov requirements. And the FDA is committed to promoting clinical trial transparency and will continue to advance compliance activities related to this ClinicalTrials.gov database. Applicable clinical trials. So applicable clinical trials are required to be registered on ClinicalTrials.gov. These trials are generally controlled clinical investigations other than phase 1 investigations of any FDA-regulated drug or biological product of any disease or condition. Not all studies on ClinicalTrials.gov are required to register or report results information. In fact, the databank includes a substantial number of studies, such as observational studies, behavioral intervention studies, phase 1 drug trials, among others, that are not required to be registered or report clinical trial information, but that do so voluntarily. Applicable clinical trials, as defined, again, are specifically defined and are subject to ClinicalTrials.gov registration and results information reporting requirements. Applicable clinical trials are subject to ClinicalTrials.gov registration requirements. So, generally speaking, applicable clinical trials are required to be registered within 21 days of the first human subject enrolled. This middle column includes a subset of data elements that are required to be included in the registration submission. I'll just name a few, like the study phase, study design, interventions controls, recruitment status, primary, secondary outcome measures, location. In this registration submission information is subject to the National Library of Medicine Quality Control Review. Applicable clinical trials are also required to update clinical trial information and are required to adhere to results information reporting requirements. So generally speaking, results information is required to be reported on ClinicalTrials.gov 1 year after primary completion date, which is specifically defined as the date when the final study participant in a clinical study is examined or receives an intervention to collect the final data for the primary outcome measure. There are certain exceptions or exceptions to the deadline through certification for delayed submission or extension requests. There are also requirements, again, to update clinical trial information every 12 months. I advise that you check out FDA's 3-part webinar series on ClinicalTrials.gov. You can find that on SBIA or FDA's website. During the 3-part webinar series, CDER discusses relevant definitions, laws, and regulations for complying with ClinicalTrials.gov registration and results information submission requirements. So who's responsible? What does this mean for you as a clinical investigator? So generally speaking, the sponsor will be considered the responsible party unless a principal investigator or clinical investigator has been designated. The responsible party is responsible for submission of registration and submission of clinical trial information, including results information on clinical trials for applicable clinical trials. Each ACT must have one and only one responsible party. If you as a clinical investigator are designated as a responsible party for registration or reporting clinical trial information of an applicable clinical trial on ClinicalTrials.gov, you need to ensure you understand the expectations and the requirements. Ensure you have access to clinical trial information and the data in order to adhere to the reporting requirements. Again, I recommend you check out FDA's resources, that 3-part webinar series on ClinicalTrials.gov. There are also extensive resources made available, really great, helpful resources available on ClinicalTrials.gov's recently updated website. So challenge question number 2. Who is responsible for ClinicalTrials.gov registration and results information submission? A, study sponsor. B, principal investigator of an investigator-initiated study. C, individual designated by a sponsor, grantee, contractor, awardee. Or D, all of the above. And as you probably guessed, D, all of the above. Again, generally the sponsor is the responsible party. For an investigator-initiated study, the sponsor investigator or the principal investigator is the responsible party. Also, an individual, such as a clinical investigator, may be designated by a sponsor to be the responsible party. So, in conclusion and summary, clinical investigators are ultimately responsible for oversight of the conduct of clinical investigations, compliance with federal law and regulations, upholding good clinical practice, and assuring human participant protection and data integrity. Again, clinical investigators are key players in driving advancements in medical knowledge and treatment options, and are entrusted with that responsibility of oversight of the conduct of clinical investigations, and are entrusted with the responsibility of assuring human participant protection and data integrity, all of which contributes to the development of new therapies and improvements in healthcare. It has been a pleasure to present during this course. I'm happy to take any questions during the panel session. At this point, I turn it over to Casa Ayalou, Division Director for the Division of Clinical Compliance Evaluation, who will speak on international clinical trials. Thank you again.